And go. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Avi Stamen, and I'm the CEO of Academic Language Experts. Thank you to Anna-Lise and Abby for joining me again today. They get an extra thank you because we actually had this event already last week, and unfortunately, I forgot to hit the record button. So we are now re-recording. They were generous enough to come back on to share their thoughts a second time, which is why you don't see an audience. We had a nice crowd first time around, but now it's just us, a more intimate setting. And that's also the reason that it took a little while to send you the recording. So we appreciate your patience with that. If you've joined us before, you know that every month I speak with innovative thought leaders in academia about how they're influencing academic publishing in the hopes of trying to create a bridge between authors and researchers, and on the one hand, and publishers on the other hand, so they better understand each other. So like I said, I'm privileged to be joined today by Anna-Lise Santella and Abby Gross, who are heads of acquisition at Oxford University Press. And from our first conversation, I already know have a lot to say, a lot of wise words to say about publication. Anna-Lise is the head of acquisition for humanities at OUP, and she's worked at OUP for about 10 years. She previously served as the acquisitions editor for Oxford's reference publications, and edited the flagship publication Grove Music Online. She's a musicologist and has taught undergraduate courses in musicology and ethnomusicology at the University of Chicago and elsewhere. Published her own research on women's orchestras, and has worked in arts administration, managing and fundraising for orchestras. She currently serves on the advisory council of the Brooklyn Conservatory of Music and on the committee for career diversity and advocacy for the Society of American Music. Abby Gross is the head of acquisition for social and behavioral sciences at OUP. Most recently, she was the editor-in-chief for psychology and social work. She oversaw a group of editors publishing across a very wide range of categories, from undergraduate textbooks and scholarly volumes through consumer health and well-being and trade books. For over 10 years, she previously had been an acquisitions editor for psychology, which offered her a really unique opportunity to learn about human behavior, support her authors, and she helped shape some of the most important and fascinating research that's coming to light. Before joining OUP, Abby worked as a scientific fact checker and copy editor, which is up my alley. She served as a research assistant for several psychological studies and tutored native and non-native English speakers in academic writing. So being that we don't have a crowd, we will not be taking questions at the end. There were questions in the first session. I will see if I can patch them in, but we will try and incorporate some of the questions from the first session to the best of our ability. If you do have any questions for us, feel free to reach out via email afterwards, and we're happy to get back to you. The interview is being recorded this time, and we're going to send it to everyone who registered. Before we kick off the event, I just want to say a word about Academic Language Experts, the company that I founded and represent. Our team at Academic Language Experts provides customized translation, editing, and academic support services to researchers, scientists, and other professionals to help them produce publication-ready texts at the highest levels. We also support scholars who are looking for help publishing their book with top university and academic publishers. And we can help with molding and helping you review your proposal in preparation for submission. We're grateful and proud that over the last few years, we've helped scholars translate, edit, and prepare their research in over 50 languages. And articles and books we've worked on have been published with top university publishers such as Harvard University Press, Yale University Press, and of course, Oxford University Press. It's our mission to help scholars achieve publication success and be a source of guidance and support along the way. So now, without any further ado, Abby and Anna-Lise, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Our pleasure.
Great. So just to get our feet wet and learn a little bit more about you, can each of you tell us a little bit about how you got into the world of academic publishing, and what is it that gets you excited when you wake up every morning and go to work? What is your job?
So Anna-Lise and I came to our roles from completely different directions. So I'll start first. I studied psychology as a college student. I was really interested in psychology and really interested in science in general. but I realized that I was much more interested in communicating about the ideas rather than discovering them and researching them myself. So this was sort of a fortuitous segue for me for starting out in sort of the nuts and bolts of primary research publishing. And then I soon moved over to OUP. I started as a assistant editor, which is the typical pathway in, and worked my way up in the psychology group, eventually taking over my own acquisitions, getting a lot of mentorship along the way from people with a lot more experience, and eventually moving into my current role, where I'm overseeing a group of editors across the social and behavioral sciences and looking for ways that we can be cohesive, build very logical and predictable publishing streams for very different markets, giving researchers what they need, and also end users being our readers as well, and making sure they have the publishing in every different format and in the most useful way possible. But also, just to say, a really big and important part of our roles is thinking about the author. What do authors need from us? What can we contribute in terms of peer review and editorial quality? What will set us apart from other publishers and so forth? So that editor-author relationship is really of central interest to us in our current roles and pretty much all the years prior. Yeah.
That's really great. That's really great and fascinating and insightful. I'm curious if there's something specific, Abby, that that you particularly enjoy in the job, or that's something that gets you excited in terms of something in the job that you love.
Yeah, I mean, from where I sit in particular, coming from the sciences or the behavioral sciences, communication is a real challenge. It's not necessarily always baked into training, and yet without communication, without clarity of thought and thinking about the reader, the research will only get so far. So I find a lot of authors struggle with it. Most of them are very open to getting feedback and working with us on it. And that's probably where I derive the greatest, the greatest feeling of reward. So that's not just with working with the text itself, but also how we position the text, how we describe it to other people, how we get other people interested in it. That's sort of the ultimate goal every day. Yeah,
that's great. And I think that it's sometimes I work with scholars who, because they're so, it's not even necessarily that they don't have the ability, but they're so deeply ingrained, they live it, that it's so hard to take a step back and think, okay, how do I describe what it is that I do to someone who doesn't visit my lab every day, or who doesn't understand the nuances, the ins and outs of my particular field and my particular area of research. And sometimes it takes someone else to kind of come in and someone who's not necessarily sitting next to you in your department to be able to say, okay, how do we translate, so to speak, what it is that you do into something that everyone will understand? Absolutely right. And I've always thought especially in publishing in the sciences, not having a background, not having a deep, an extensive academic background has been helpful for me, because I can really represent the reader, represent the non-expert in the relationship. Nice. Fantastic. So Anna-Lise, I turn to you now. So yeah, tell me a little bit about how you got into academic publishing and what you really love and enjoy about your work.
Sure. And somewhat different. I think it's actually kind of nice because I think between the two of us, we represent the two kind of primary paths into publishing, which is someone who comes up through the publishing business, and then somebody comes through the academic side, which is what I did. So I came out of a PhD program in musicology, and I had actually even there had a bit of an unusual career, in that I was sort of bouncing back and forth between academia and working in arts administration because of my deep interest in and background in orchestral music, and which ended up becoming my research topic as well as this sort of separate career. And those, when I came to OUP and publishing for a very particular job, which was editing the Grove Dictionary of Music, or Grove Music Online, which is a key resource in my field. I had read huge swaths of it as a graduate student and an undergraduate, and loved the book. And it was so I entered publishing as an editor, up a little bit further along, without any publishing knowledge, but with a very deep knowledge of my field. So very different perspective from Abby. And I built my knowledge of publishing through my knowledge of my field, and gradually took on more and more of the humanities as an editor in the reference department, and more recently moved over to be handling the research books and looking at our acquisitions writ large across many fields. And for me, my field specifics actually does help me as an editor. And just as Abby feels like her lack of knowledge helps you, I think there are different strengths from those backgrounds. For me, I know how scholarship works. I know how I work as a scholar. I know what the pitfalls are, and I know that those things really apply across most fields. So there are certain ways I think about what I do with the lists that I work on, and the lists that the editors I work with work on, and am able to coach from that point, if that makes sense. In terms of why I love the job, there are so many reasons, but I think for me, the thing that really drives me is the subject matter and the opportunity to define fields and to define fields in a forward-looking way, so that we're building on a long history at Oxford of scholarship, but creating tools and resources for future directions and helping authors understand where their work fits within that trajectory, so that they're supporting a bigger project, that we are supporting the authors through that bigger project and building connections and important sort of cross-fertilization across the field and between fields.
Wow. So, okay, so what's really interesting is sort of something that I picked up from both of what you said, is that it's probably both an opportunity but also a challenge to work with such a variety, a cross-section of authors from so many different fields. And I'm sure that over time you get a feeling for some of the content of these fields, but you're not a content expert in every single piece that comes in. So how do, it's sort of a double-sided question, how do you handle being sort of the gatekeepers of materials that you may or may not be familiar with previously? That's part A. And then part B is, in what way should the answer to that question impact how authors, when they're writing their proposal, approach the subject or approach explaining what it is they're doing? So in a very practical sense, should I assume that you know what I'm talking about, or should I assume that I should, kind of like give a very basic background so that, to kind of ease my way into presenting the research that I'm doing?
That's such a good question.
Yeah.
I'll take a start. This is maybe not a direct answer, but something that this makes me think about is the proposal document as a communications vehicle and how it will be read by several different people in several different ways. So the way it will be read by the peer reviewer, really engaging with the content. What is the coverage like? Are you referencing all the right research? Is the argument really cogent? Is it contributing something new to the very specific field of study, et cetera? It's very different from how a publicity manager might be reading a proposal, or an acquisitions editor, or someone else on the team who's looking for very specific things. So I think that poses a challenge actually for authors who might not realize how what they're developing is going to be used and read in so many ways. Anna-Lise, why don't you step in?
Just tagging on to that, I think one of the things to know is that the proposal gets read both by people with a very deep knowledge of the field, like the peer reviewers, and also people with virtually no knowledge of the field in some cases, like when we take it to our board of delegates who know scholarship generally, but maybe from a completely different area. So so we do need to create proposals that speak to both of those, that that recognize the depth of the field and the interest of the field, but also explain things in ways that people who are knowledgeable of scholarship but not of the specifics can understand. And I think that's often a challenge for authors, and that's frankly a lot of what we do during the proposal process, is help authors walk that line. Yeah. I've kind of forgotten what the original question was.
Yeah, me too.
That's all right.
But
classic digressions.
No,
but let me jump on that to say, because Avi had asked about not being a non-specialist and having
yeah.
work reviewed by people who might not have interest or not interest, have experience in your field. And I think that's actually, again, I thought it was a really interesting question. In a sense, when, you know, scholars are trained to write for people with similar expertise and experience as them. So there's a whole sub-language for every discipline, right? You reference the name of an author, everyone knows who it is. You reference a paper, everyone knows what it is. When you're writing a proposal, or you're writing a piece of sample writing, or perhaps you're writing a blog post or an article for a mainstream publication, you don't have that language connection with your reader. So, and that reader might be your acquisitions editor, it might be a reader of a newspaper. So you really, I would say, and this is my very brief experience early in my career as a fact checker, where we actually stopped at every single word, and you had to question every single word and whether it was accurate. In a sense, not that you have to always go that far, but when you're writing for different audiences, you have to think about, will your reader understand what you're saying when you reference a paper just by the last name of the author? And why are you referencing that paper? Maybe it's because it radically changed the way everyone in your field thought about a certain topic, or it added a new perspective. So I think it's like adding that scaffolding in for your reader without assuming that they necessarily have the time or interest to go into, you know, the column of history that went behind that particular thought. So that's not exactly specific, but it is the experience from the reader's perspective of trying to sort of read between the lines of scholarly writing and the language of a particular field.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
if I could just jump in terms of
Please.
what to expect from the editor and our expertise. I think, you know, any editor who's been working in the business for a while builds a tremendous amount of expertise in the field, but it's not necessarily our goal to be the leader on that information at all times. Like I think there's a certain amount of humility required from editors where we need to rely on experts and know who they are. And that's, if we don't know something, we will have that discussion with the author. We will bring in peer reviewers. We will work with our networks to kind of make sure that we are informed. That does happen sometimes, particularly if someone's new in a field and you're building your knowledge. So, but you can rely on us to, if not know the details, to know how to get them and to take that initiative.
Yeah, that's great. And it's fascinating to me. I think there's also a positive, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but I think there's a positive consequence to the way it's set up, in the sense that there are both expert reviewers as well as non-expert reviewers, which is challenging for the author because they kind of have to speak to two, right? We always teach our students, write for your audience. Well, what happens when I have three audiences, right? So that's definitely, that's easier said than done. But I think the end result ends up being better. And one thing that we do in our company, it's interesting to see some of the parallels, is whenever we get a text for translation or a text for editing, we always have a subject expert do the initial work, whether it's the edit or the translation, and then we have a generalist do a proofread. Because what I want to happen is I want it to go through, I want it to be sound in terms of terminology and you know, and main and understanding of the main theories and conceptual frameworks. I want that to be clear, but I also want it to be that if someone who, and I'm thinking, you know, in the context of both books, but as well as journals, if I get a desk editor or an acquisitions editor that's not a subject expert, have I lost them after 2 sentences? And if I have, then even if it may be groundbreaking, I may not be able to penetrate, you know, the way that I would like. So it's, I think there's, again, I'm not sure if it is intentional, but I think there's a, you know, unintended consequence of having a mixture of both with that, which actually produces a better result in the end of the day.
And it's certainly something we need for the books themselves. You know, we, even within scholarly fields, sorry, something just blocked my window. So even within just, you know, scholarly publication, even for monographs, people are going to pick things up from other fields because they're interested in the way in which your topic connects with it, and maybe coming to it without a knowledge of the in-field jargon and all of that. So it's always good to be thinking about like both internal and external audiences. I think even in very specific cases, I think exceptions would be like things that are very technical, that would be, you know, methodologies and things like that, where there's you know, less of a need for connection maybe. But do you have anything else you want to say about that, Abby?
Yeah. And something I was just thinking of was another element of how a publisher or an editor or a non-specialist reader in the publishing business will be looking at these proposal documents or other sorts of communications. We tend to put this kind of writing into categories like, is this a synthesis? Is this a building block? Is this a new argument? So we might not necessarily engage at the detailed subject level. Like you do, Avi, we engage with subject matter experts all the time. That's absolutely critical, bread and butter, everyday part of our roles. But we're looking at what is this type of contribution that we're making to scholarship or public knowledge, and then we will move the style of writing from there. In some cases, you actually don't want the writing to meet the needs of a general public. That's not always appropriate. And I have this conversation with authors all the time, because we talk about impact, and we talk about one of the reasons for this conversation that we set up is to talk about career success and building up an author's impact in the field or beyond. And a lot of authors think that well, that means I have to reach the general public. And sometimes actually that's not the most important way, or the most important way to use your research. Maybe you want to reach the 100 policymakers who are actually changing the way our government is working on a particular topic, or you want to reach the 50 scientists who are working on a vaccine for a particular disease. So in those cases, you actually don't want to spend the time to break it down and try to reach the general public. So these are, we help direct authors, and then once we know who the audience is, we can work from there. But we don't necessarily limit ourselves to any one of the audiences.
So I want to piggyback off that, because it's a good segue to sort of our main topic, which is thinking about your publications within the broader context of how you want to build out your career. And I think, Abby, you had shared with me sort of a framework that you had thought about in terms of how to think about what my end goals are, and then how do I, sort of set up my publication accordingly. So if you could share, how you think about that, and also, how to make that jump from my career decision to where I'm going to publish. Because I think that from my experience, from what I see, is it's sort of, whoever agrees is where I'm going to publish, right? It's a little bit of people, are throwing darts at a dartboard and hoping that one of them sticks, which is understandable, and it's a very competitive, to publish a book, an academic book, is not an easy endeavor, and it's competitive, and it makes sense that, that we'll go with those who go with us. But maybe if we do it a little bit more strategically, we'll actually be hitting, maybe we take less shots, if we're continuing with this metaphor, but they're aimed at, at publishers that are more appropriate. So how would you recommend to strategize about that?
Yeah. I of course sympathize with the dartboard approach, especially in early career. Why not give it the best shot? And that's great. Maybe you'll make connections that you wouldn't have had. One of the great things about academic publishers is that we employ editors who really want to talk to authors and prospective authors. We also want to talk to people who might not be prospective authors yet, but will be in 5 years. So editors generally at academic presses want to hear from you, want to talk to you. So that's sort of nice to know, that no one ever minds being emailed or approached at a conference.
And I just want to draw a line under that, because I think that's something that graduate students in particular really struggle with. They often feel like we're unapproachable, and we go to conferences for the very purpose of talking to them and talking to other scholars about their work. So you should never feel shy about approaching editors.
Agreed. Now the next part of the question, which is the big question, how to start, figuring out who you're going to target when you are thinking about publishers. It's not always the biggest name brand for your field. Every academic field has a couple presses that are most deeply in that field. And that means they are really plugged in. They probably have editors who are very embedded, very much understand the ins and outs of the field. And that might be OUP. It might be, I think Anna-Lise's example was University of Illinois Press. It might be Michigan State Press. It might be University of Chicago. I mean, there are so many this is just university presses in the US. It's what makes the academic and university press world, vibrant and interesting and kind of quirky in a lot of ways. So the first thing is it's really obvious. It's just which presses are really in your field and investing in it. A big press like OUP, we're not in every single field, but we are in a large majority of them in some way. And so it might seem like OUP is your first shot, or CUP or Cambridge. But I really would say you start with your main, academic society and look at who's exhibiting. You also look at which publishers publish the books that you think are most important. So this is like a basic, way in. And that's really a question about which publishers are in your field. Fine. Moving on from that, who are you trying to reach? And if you're trying to reach a market or an audience, of fellow scholars and graduate students, you really should be looking at university presses. You really should be looking at academic presses. And you don't need to quibble too much between them. It's about who has the most reach to those scholars. But then if you're thinking about reaching practitioners, reaching the general public, reaching some combination of the two, reaching a professional audience, that's where you really have to ask the questions of your publisher. And it's not necessarily how are you marketing to them, which is, I think, is often the first question that comes up, but it's really, do you already reach them? Because if you don't already reach them, placing a couple ads is not going to make that happen. Publishers know where we have reach. And I know in my own area at OUP within the behavioral sciences, there are some applied fields that we have deep reach in. We have brand recognition, we have a core set of authors, we have a core set of readers. There are other practitioner fields. I would love to be in those fields. We are not quite there yet. There are other competitors that have more market share. So, those are the real detailed questions that I think editors should ask of their publishers when they're considering. In some cases, and I will take a pause in a moment, but Anna-Lise jump in. In some places, we find some authors don't mind if a publisher doesn't have deep reach into a specific field because they are happy with, let's say, the overall digital platform and sort of the wider global distribution system that a publisher might have. Obviously, I'm speaking from our perspective because those are two things that we work on, we invest a lot in. So, if there's no right or wrong answer, it really is what you're looking for. And whether you're looking for a publisher that maybe has a very small list and is going to work with you very closely day by day, or a publisher that might have a larger scale and offer other things. So Anna-Lise, why don't you share your perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of got a little bit at the end to the kind of difference between small and large presses, which I think is really important because there are advantages to both of them, and it's going to really depend on how you work and what kind of reach you want to have. Small presses, I think I'm thinking about this a little bit in terms of first books, where I think these questions loom really especially large, where you're kind of trying to build those relationships on which you'll base the rest of your career. And I do encourage you to think both about the topic of the book and the press that's right for that, and also about building relationships for a career. I think they're two separate things. You may find them in the same press on the first try, you may not. I think when we recorded this the first time, I used an example for my field. Oxford is the press for musicology, hands down. They publish by far the most books, the most respected books. It's like my graduate student advisors all said, try Oxford first and then everybody else. That's not actually great advice though, necessarily. And for my subfield, University of Illinois Press is more focused on my my area and has more specific reach. So it sort of depends on whether I'm trying to, if my plan with my book on women's orchestras is to go and publish at a press and then change or broaden my topic, I might want a bigger press for that. I might want to start building relationships for that. But if I'm planning on going deep into feminist musicology, I probably, like, the smaller press might be more appropriate for me. So that's a question that I want to think about when I'm making those kinds of decisions about my work. And it's good to think about. I think the other thing is the editors themselves. Talk to them. Find out how you work with them. They, within those, if you're picking a small or large press, if you, you know, or, you know, it may be picked for you, as we said earlier. Sometimes you're just trying to throw the dart. But, you know, if you're trying to kind of decide what seems best for you, talk to those editors and see, because they will also give you a read on what they will do and how they will approach it and how much time they'll have for you. And, one of the things about smaller presses is your book is a bigger percentage of their publications. So you might get a little bit more personal attention in a smaller press than you would at a bigger press. With a bigger press, you're going to get a bigger list to help sell your book, other books that will be packaged with it. And you, as Abby mentioned, you might have more digital resources or more, sort of more things that require a broader investment that big presses can do better a lot of the time. So those are just all things to think about in terms of your specifics.
That's a great.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just to jump off that. In taking the line about talking to your editor, which again, a point we always want to make. But something I really encourage people, prospective authors thinking about their publishing plans, is to share your overall career arc that you envision with your editor. And of course that might change. No one knows what they're going to be doing for 20, 25 years. But if you say, like, look, this is my passion. I need to get this book, this first book out, or the second book out, or I really want to do this synthetic kind of review work. And I'm really trying to build up my expertise in this area, and I'm trying to make connections here. And some point later in my career, I really dream of breaking out and sharing this with a wider public, or bringing this perspective to this other field or these other fields. I think it really helps because your editor can strategize with you. And it's also okay for the editor to say, you know what, we would be among the best publishers for this project. If you think you want to go in that direction with your career, like, I'll help advise you on where you might go next. We might not be the best press for that. And all publishers do that, the large ones and the small ones, because we know we can't do everything and we can't be everything for everybody. But once we're invested in someone's career and we see them as someone that we hope to work with through the rest of our own career, it becomes like a mutually advising relationship.
That's great. And I think that, I mean, what I think is a very simple piece of advice that I give to authors who come to me and say, here's my manuscript, where do you think I should publish it, is, have you taken a look at your bibliography recently, right? Meaning, like, and I know this took me time to get used to as well, is when I pick up a book, obviously I'm interested in the contents, but before you do that, and before you start, reading through, take a second and look at who the publisher is. And if you're noticing, okay, you know what, I'm sitting in the library and this is the third book, that I've opened up from the same publisher today, maybe there's a sign there that they're interested. And I think that one piece that maybe you haven't mentioned is the concept of a series as well, right? You're trying to find, oftentimes your book is not a standalone, it is part of a greater, series that's of interest to the publisher. So the same way you take your time to do your literature review before you write your article, before you write your book, do a publisher review, take some time on the different websites, see see if there are series that speak to you, see if there are other, pieces of research in your field that have some sort of connection, so that you're not coming totally in. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't come in with totally fresh ideas that aren't, that haven't been looked through before. But I do think that if a publisher has a reputation or has shown that they're interested in topic X and your topic is related to that, then you're already a few steps ahead of someone who's trying to pitch a project which really the publisher hasn't really taken on before.
That's a great point. And that also makes me think about how you can do sort of light touch research on publishers and look for certain clues as to what their priorities are. So one clue would be design. This isn't necessarily of central importance to everyone, but it is important in some areas or to some people. Take a look at how your publisher approaches cover design, and what can you learn from that? Are they placing a value on the cover as a way to attract an audience? Are they taking a different approach? Again, it's something that we're really proud of at Oxford. I think we have amazing cover designers and art directors. And we feel really proud of that when we go out into the world and see our books out there on book tables. In some fields, that's clearly, that's not going to sell a book. My mentor always said that book covers in academia are not going to sell books. And we might have debated that a little bit, because I think it does show that we think the presentation is important. A lot of publishers do amazing work there. So that's just one example. What's another clue, Anna-Lise, do you think that someone else could find without having to perform interviews?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's I hadn't actually really thought about that. I just look at websites and look at look at their not just in your list, but also look at what they're doing in related areas and see. I think one of the things that I think is often important for people is how a publisher handles interdisciplinary work and how they sell it. So maybe take a look at like things that are on the sort of edges of your field that are overlapping with other fields and see where they land on the press's website. And or if they have an online version, if they have online publications, see how those turn up there and how they're cataloged and how the press is thinking about interdisciplinary work. I think that can also be a really good thing to check.
Interesting. So yeah, just a postscript about the covers. And I don't want to get off in too much of a tangent, but there was a cover of actually one of our employees who published a book with Oxford, and he sent it to us before the book was sent out, and it was incredible to me because he asked what we thought about it and he wanted some feedback, and there was so much detail, and it was a piece of art really. And I sat there for 10 minutes looking at it, and what struck me was not just that there was time and thought put into it and how it connects to the topic of the book, et cetera, but that there are, like you said, in certain fields, it's almost like the plain minimalistic, essentialist, basic cover is sort of what is done throughout. And I'm sure there's a lot to, sort of think about there, what that says about the book itself. But I do want to move on because there are other topics that I think are really important and that I want to get to. So when we're talking about, so I love two-part questions. I'm sorry if that makes life difficult, but I'll ask you another one because everything is related somehow, right? So when thinking about academics who are active in their careers now, so let's say academics who haven't necessarily reached tenure or are working towards that or are working towards professorship, how do the public, specifically in the context of publishing, how do their challenges or the goals and objectives that they have differ from previous generations? And you know what? That's enough of that's enough of a loaded question. I'll leave it at that, and I'll get to my next part afterwards. But do you think there's a difference, and if so, how would you categorize that?
Anna-Lise, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, from the publishing side, I think we are more strategic than we used to be about monographs in particular, that we are looking for things that will speak beyond just the narrow subfield, which I think was something that was often enough to get things through. And we're more selective about monographs than we used to be. That may not be true of every press, but that is true for us. And in general, just that there's more market pressures. And more ways to publish now, so that are sort of changing the way we think. In addition to traditional academic presses, there's open access publishing, there's self-publishing, there's just like a lot of different ways to get your information out in the world. And we're still one of the ways that is valued by the academic ecosystem in general. But it's not the only way to get your material out there. So depending on what you're doing, there may be more options for you, even if we're being a little bit more selective. Do you want to? I mean, Abby, you actually have a little more experience with some of the, or longer experience with this.
It's a big question. What's changed over the generations, and it's of deep interest to us. Authors now have a lot of options in front of them. In the sense they have the same pressures in the milestones they need to meet to get tenure in their respective roles if they're so lucky. But that's not the only way forward anymore. There are opportunities available to those with PhDs that weren't quite as vibrant 25 years ago, right? There have been whole industries that have just swooped in and heavily recruit, let's say, social scientists into the tech industry, which is the example I think about a lot. And so that's changed a little bit. And that doesn't mean you don't necessarily need to publish, but you'll want to publish in a different way, and you're not going to necessarily publish monographs if you take that career route.
Well, if I could, sorry, if I could jump in for a second,
Yeah.
even within academia, there's more and more digital dissertations happening. It's still not a huge array, but there are people who are coming out of their PhDs without having written a book, but having written something else. So I think that is, I mean, there's more change ahead there as well.
Yeah, I think something we fussed about and we were really concerned about maybe 10 to 15 years ago was whether the book or the monograph as the core vessel would persist through all these changes and 10 different ways you can publish or speak to 25 different types of audiences. What's really happened is that that core vessel hasn't changed. It's still the ultimate sort of slow publishing. But it does mean that it's not the only way anymore, the way it may have been in the 60s or the 70s. You want to get your idea out there, you're gonna do it in a book, and you're gonna try to be a public intellectual. So that's why we see, and this is in part what inspired these conversations that inspired this conversation, was thinking about the book as part of a larger portfolio. And a lot of authors, I would say a lot of young authors, but actually a lot of older authors are really sophisticated these days too. About saying, I want to start doing, talks that I video and put online. Maybe it's through TEDx or through a different venue or what have you, or digitizing my own lectures. Maybe I'm going to have an op-ed strategy. Maybe I'm going to write blogs. Maybe I'm going to publish as much as I can on sites like The Conversation that hub together academic thought packaged in a very user-friendly way. And it's all of a piece. It all comes together. I think the point is that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one publication basket. The thing about the book is that, unless you decide to do an updated new edition, second edition in 5 to 7 years or whatever, the book is crystallized. And it's sort of the version of record. But then you can go out and you can do your journal articles, you do all the other publishing, and it creates an ultimate package that supports your ultimate platform wherever it goes.
That actually raises like one other distinction, I think, which is that it used to be that the dissertation book was generally the first thing you published, and that is less and less true. I think, at least in the humanities, more and more there's more and more pressure for graduate students to be publishing articles ahead. So I think there often is a different relationship to the book when you get there. That you may have published a chapter or two ahead. You shouldn't publish more than that, or we will have trouble selling your book. But there's the book is even more now, I think, part of that package, and you may have a different kind of relationship to what a book looks like by the time you've sort of dealt with the chapters as cohesive pieces that you've tried to publish.
Yeah. And I want to make what I think is an important point also about maybe a feeling after hearing what both of you are saying and saying, well, that's in theory, I'd love to do all those things, but in practice, I mean, just fulfilling the academic duties and responsibilities, especially given most, the coursework that we haven't even mentioned, but all these other things there, I'd love to do a bunch of them, but how can I? So 2 important points. Number one is that I think the options that Abby was giving are not that you have to do all of those, but rather think about your field and which one of these, where are people located in a virtual sense, most likely, but where is your audience? Is it going to be on social media? Is it going to be an independent blog? Is it going to be you send out a newsletter once a week? Is it going to be through video abstracts that that you just kind of take your research and sum it up in a really clear and crystallized and coherent way and put it up on YouTube, and maybe that will take off, and then you might need to experiment a little bit because it may take you a bit of time to figure out where exactly they are. So you don't need to, point A is you don't need to do everything. Point B is don't look at it as a separate activity to your research. I know I've seen scholars who start out with just a thought piece blog that they're, sort of working through, and maybe they turn it into a series because they say they got some response and feedback. And then they say, okay, this can actually be turned into a research project. I'm going to lecture about it and see what feedback I get at a more, proper formal academic conference. And then that eventually turns into an article, which is the basis for a book. So instead of seeing all these pieces as sort of, additional, responsibilities that are, a burden, I think especially if we choose the forum which is most enjoyable to us, because that should be one of the criteria for how we choose how to get our research out there, we can actually get back to our original goals of making an impact on whatever field we went into, either because we're fascinated by it because it's really important to us, A, but B is it can actually be an early stage sounding board.
There was one thing about what Abby was saying is that I thought should be emphasized, and we've been kind of talking around it, is that it's really important to ask why you want to publish.
Mm-hmm.
Not just, and there will be practical answers like, I need to get a book in my tenure file. But there are also like, it may be like you want to make your family happy. It may be that you want to enact political change. It may be that you want to change the way scientists are researching something. There's just, there's so many different reasons for doing it, and knowing what those are and being clear about them with yourself and sharing them with your editor will help you make a better book or better project or whatever it is you're trying to publish.
I think that's exactly right. And how do you see that playing out specifically in the humanities? I'm just curious, because I know a lot of the folks who joined the first go round were coming from all across the humanities, so many areas. That's not my area of expertise, so I'm just curious how you see that playing out.
So in terms of like, what impact do you want to have in the humanities? I think there's a lot of things. I mean, I think there are some activist reasons. But I actually think a lot of humanities scholars are not clear on this to themselves. There are plenty of people who go into academia who are like, the book is a hurdle I have to get through. Yeah. And I'm excited about this topic, and here it is, but aren't thinking about what they want people to do with their scholarship. And that's the thing that you need to think about. Like, if you have written, and this is true for whether it's a very broad general interest topic or very focused technical specific topic. I was just reading a proposal for we're releasing in paperback a book on mensural notation. So this is a very specific style of notating the meter of music that was used in like medieval Renaissance era, and what its impact has been on the way in which we think about musical structure. It's a super fascinating book, but it's highly technical. It's like music theory for people who do early music. There's not very many people who do that. So, but thinking about, that it's very clear from reading that book, and this is by a very senior scholar who's spent an entire career working on things like this, but thinking about what you want to accomplish. And even though that's a very technical subject, she is looking towards making an impact on the way in which we think about how music is performed, how music is thought about, how even the cultural history of music, what kinds of priorities we put on music as a basis of the way in which this very early music in Western European history was structured. So there are, even with technical topics, there can be peel back the onion a little bit and look for those background level questions that drove you to that very specific topic in the first place.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
Abby, we went on without you.
No, please, that's great. This is great. I apologize. My internet dropped out, but we sorted that out. All right. Well, I'm glad. You know what? Next time I just won't show up. I'll let you run the interview yourselves. Thank you. I appreciate you continuing. So I don't know what you were just talking about, but I'll jump on to the next question, which is, Abby, you mentioned a really interesting thing to me in our previous conversation about using a book as an opportunity to pivot in your career. So let's say you started out on an academic path, and now you maybe want to branch out into industry or into trade. or the opposite. Maybe you've done 20 years in trade and you want to kind of and you've now made the switch to become an academic, completed your PhD, and want to get into the academic world. So how do you see a book as a way to do that?
Yeah, I see two ways, just sort of thinking through it. One way is to change the way you might be perceived or change your platform in some way. If you're known for this one area of scholarship within your field, but you want to be known by people in other fields, or you want to be known by an applied or professional audience or general public. So that's really about your author platform. And, I'm not saying it's easy. It's really challenging to make that leap. But a book can be part of that effort. Again, it can't be the only tool. But if let's say you're a professor in a business school and you want to have a larger platform out in the business community. And this is a very common place to be in this world. So that would be very simple. So you want to start talking up all the consulting and advising you're doing. You want to basically share what you're probably already doing, and the advice that you're providing, because you probably are providing a lot of advice, and you probably are being solicited by large corporations or business journalists or so forth. So making that part of your story. Secondly, then it's working on that messaging and working on that writing. And I find just in that business example, I find a lot of faculty become very skilled very quickly in doing that communications, because they are in demand for that translational piece, translations from scholarship to practice. So that was just one example of changing the way that you might be perceived. It's also giving talks, doing newsletters, and so all those examples that we use. The other piece of pivoting is I just literally I had a great idea and I just
as soon as it dawns on you'll raise your hand and we'll be happy to jump back in. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there may be a piece where you need to switch editors or publishing houses if you're doing that too. And so I think one of the things to think about is how you might use your current network and platform to help you make connections to cross over. Editors can often help you with that, but not always. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Abby.
Yes, that is again, that comes back to what we were saying earlier about being honest about what your goals are, even if they are still in the process of forming. Sorry, I remember what I was going to say. And then is using the writing project as your learning process. And I've heard this from some authors. It's not always the leap from academic to trade. In some cases, it's a pivot within your area of research. But you can learn a lot through the process of writing. You can learn a lot through the process of developing a collected work, and bringing together, inviting contributions from a lot of different scholars and learning from them on the go or in the process. It could be writing a trade book where you have to do a lot of investigation that's, takes you out of your comfort zone a little bit. And then you have to field test the material, and you have to, work with an editor who's going to be tough on you and help hone the text. So sometimes I think that doesn't always come through when you're writing a book. You think, oh, by the time I get to the point where I'm writing a book, I'm going to be the expert. It's just going to fly out of my head onto the page, and actually it can be a huge learning process, and you can use it as such.
Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely.
And Anna-Lise, we touched on this earlier, but I kind of want to dive into it a little bit more. There, to me at least, seems to be a trend of academic books, but that are intended for a much wider audience, that try to break out of the of the academic world and really touch a more popular world. And sometimes these are published by academic presses. Sometimes some academic presses have actually taken more of an interest in these popular titles that are meant for public intellectuals or and the like. But sometimes it's non-academic presses that are publishing these manuscripts. And I'm curious if you've noticed a similar trend, what you think about it, and whether you think it's important for academics to consider this as a potential pathway for their careers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend on the project and what you want to accomplish, and you know, nobody should feel like they have to write a trade book. I think it's absolutely not necessary for an academic career. But it might be something that you want to do, or that you would help your particular area of work. So, you know, I think the question is going to be it's going to be a very individualized question. I feel like there's a piece of this that I just sort of went out of my head, that a piece of your question that I've lost.
I mean, maybe you could speak to the trend in general, and just, you know, what you've noticed, why you think academic publishers have, and again, I don't want to overly generalize, because I know this is, you know, only specific publishers and only specific manuscripts, but what trends have you noticed, if any, and why do you think this is you know, a direction that some publishers are deciding to go down?
Sure. I mean, I actually think there's a bunch of reasons. Some of them have to do with making academic books more marketable, just a purely financial, like, you know, survival mechanism for some presses. That we have to think about the way in which we can expand our audiences for books, and authors will be thinking about that expansion from a completely different way. But that's just so you know, that is that part of the equation for publishers, even academic publishers. The other thing that you might want to do is just you know, I think there's been a lot of pressure on the humanities in particular. So, I mean, I think there's other areas of academia that have had this too, but you know, right now we're kind of under attack. You know, in the UK, they've just, you know, done a major slash and burn of arts and humanities programs. That's really kind of alarming. And there's a lot of publication right now on what we call public humanities, where people are kind of making statements about what the humanities mean and why it's important for all of our lives, you know, for a variety of reasons. So there's a certain amount of justification that is happening that is resulting in a lot of public forum kind of publishing, and in both small and large forms like books. So I think that's another area where trade books can really like make a difference in terms of the way the sort of whole humanities project or the local sort of piece of it can be perceived. And so that might be part of the impact that you want to have. I think this is especially happening in history right now, that there's just been a ton of history publication. It seems like more people are reading very academic books in history than used to. And so we're packaging things that might have been more serious academic books as more trade books so that people will find them because there's a market there. So it's not necessarily about a change in the way the books are written entirely. Some of it is about just people's willingness to read kind of fairly dense material without being academics, just out of their own personal interest and their interest in engaging with the world around them. So that's something, yeah. Sorry.
That's a really interesting point. And I think part of that might be the long tail, the way we've moved towards long tail. I'm sorry, we've always been a long tail publisher, right? And most academic publishers are, but until the internet.
You might want to explain what that means.
Yeah, can you define that?
Instead of publishing, let's say, a collection of hugely selling titles every year, we publish a wide array in so many different areas, speaking to so many different small but important areas of focus, and then collectively that makes up our larger portfolio. There's a lot of different definitions of long tail. I would encourage people to Google it if they're not familiar with it, as different applications. But I think the thing is that before people could Google anything, this is making me feel very gray haired to even talk about this. It was hard for people to find whatever is their very specific interest. So nowadays, if you have a very deep interest in macrame with a certain kind of material, that's a terrible example, you have a community of people who are interested in that. And the same thing is if you're interested in a particular 5-year span in British history. And I think academic publishers, large academic publishers, have certainly fit really well with that that evolution in discoverability, because we can give, if you have a niche interest, a niche academic interest, we probably have something for you. And that has sort of opened up the doors in terms of us feeling very happy and comfortable to go out and acquire and publish this kind of work. but it also creates more pressure on the text itself to be discoverable. So that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, I think those are some of the dynamics going on. I think to Anna-Lisa's good point, it's an interchange between the readers discovering and the authors writing and the publishers publishing.
The other thing that reminds me that is I think there's a little less mediation than there used to be.
Yeah.
Pre-Google, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, academics relied a lot on word of mouth and other scholarship to find things. And I think because of the searchability of everything, there's a really a very different kind of array of materials that you can engage with without kind of going through other things that might have been harder to get at in previous generations. And, I think as a researcher, that's probably affected your research too, right? Because, I think about when I first started working on my project, which is archival, I was going to archives. I was sitting in the dark reading microfilm and scanning through entire, I work a lot with historical newspapers, so you'd have to go through all of the microfilm, go through the entire newspaper to find that thing that might or might not be there about like that thing you were looking for. And once ProQuest digitized all that stuff, I can sit in my house and search for the specific thing. And it's great in many respects. It's much more efficient, but I lose something too. I lose that context of having to go through the newspaper and see all of those other things that were going on at the same time. And I have to build that back into my scholarship. So there are, I think that even for publishers, we are looking at this kind of broad array of materials that we can bring in and help build. We think more, I think, about the whole list. And I'm not talking about just an individual editor's list or an individual subject list at a press, but the entire list of a press. Everything that we publish is now like this big behemoth of content that we think about in a different way than we did 5-10 years ago. So it's just, and that builds connections. There's really good things that come out of that, but there's some stuff lost too. We're losing some of that, that bespoke individual curation. It's still there, but it's a little bit more hidden. So I think what that means for the future of publishing, I'm not exactly sure. It's just meaning you're going to find things in different ways, and it's probably going to mean you're going to see things differently than you did when it was less searchable.
And also from the author's perspective, with the goal of reaching readers, there's a value to having this two-pronged approach. So one, you're going through, if you consider the publisher one of the mediators, we're a gate, we help surface content, we package it in a certain way, and we try to put it in front of people's faces. But you can also reach those same readers simultaneously by through your social media approach, through engaging with them one-on-one on Twitter or on LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever. I think that combination is really effective.
Yeah,
I think if you rely solely on the mediator, whether it's the publisher, the bookstore, the retailer, you might not be as effective as you do this full court press. And
you'll get different information both ways. So yeah, it's important to do everything, do it across the board.
Yeah, and Annalisa, that your example really struck home about the microfilms, because I think about this in the context of going to the library to take out a book, right? When you're going to find a specific book in the library, how many other books surrounding that one book that you're looking for do you end up flipping through, and may actually be much more interesting and relevant to your research than the book you were actually looking for?
Absolutely.
Now, that's a thing of the past.
Absolutely.
I mean,
how do you replace the stacks? Yeah. I mean, I think as a digital, when I was working as the editor of a digital publication for Gross and Online, we spent a lot of time thinking about how do you replicate browse? What can you do to create a browse experience so that you can find some of that stuff related? And I think different publications will come up with different ways, but I think one of the things that publishers need to be thinking about is the way in which we group things so that we have some broad categories that can be just flipped through, so that people can, it's about thinking about the categorization of our materials and the sort of taxonomy by which we think about our work. But that stuff that's under the surface that you can't see necessarily as a user of our websites is really, really important. And I hope that we'll be doing more with that in the future, because I think that the loss of browse is browsing the stacks is one of those, absolutely essential research
Yeah.
pieces that we haven't fully explored in the digital space yet.
Yeah, and even as we try to replicate it through, you read this, you might be interested in this, right? Which is the user experience we're all accustomed to. Is, because scientists have basically explained that cognitively we don't take in that information the same way as we would take in, seeing the stacks. So I think we have to understand it's never gonna be the same experience.
No.
So we can't try to replace it. We just have to make up for it different ways.
Yeah, the other issue I think that this brings up, which we've gone well past our our mandate here, but I think it's a fascinating topic, is the fact that in an ironic way, in order for those suggestions or browse in a digital way to be helpful, we need to give up a certain amount of privacy. It doesn't necessarily need to be, Facebook or Google level, but the more that the algorithms know about us, the better they can help us. On the other hand, we lose sort of our, private autonomy. So whereas if I'm choosing to go to a library and I decide to, that this is the stack, okay, that's my personal decision. Whereas if the decisions are being made for me to a certain sense, it's helpful and good. But in order for the algorithms to really be smart enough to do it, they need to learn a lot about who I am and what I'm interested in and what I'm doing. So anyway, I think it's like an interesting sort of ethical.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to add, food for thought. And I think just bringing this back together to publication strategy is that I think what we're getting at here is it's going to be a constant conversation with your reader, or your discoverer, or the person who's being tracked because they've discovered you online. And that ultimately is at the core of this entire conversation, that you're not publishing into a void, you're publishing for readers. And that starts at the proposal and it ends with the final text. And you're not off the hook at any step of the process.
All right, I want to wrap up with one final question, which I think is important, and then I will thank you for your time and let you go. I'm curious how I get a lot of authors who are looking for a publisher who will do the work for them to get their book out there, and I think that publishers have a different perspective of the author-publisher relationship and how that's most effective. So can you maybe just in a positive sense, maybe paint a picture for us on what authors, aside from the strength of their proposal, what are you looking from authors, let's say once the proposal is accepted, or that really make it most impactful and effective and help get the word out there in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I can start with this and then throw this over. I think the most important thing is leveraging their expertise and their authority. Let us do the investment in the back end with Amazon and the discoverability and the SEO and all that stuff, which is it's invisible, but it's so important. And I would always tell authors to focus on, if your book is on birds, then get out there and start sharing your expertise about birds to all the audiences that might be interested in your book, or maybe the book would inspire interest. And we can help you with that. We can help you craft that kind of strategy. And let us focus on the technical, the behind the scenes, through creating the conditions for reach. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think this gets back to what we've been talking about the whole time about author platform. What is your platform? What is your ability to reach out? And so I think part of that is your network. So go to your societies, write on your blog, place an op-ed if that's something you do or that's appropriate for a topic. It's not again, like we mentioned all of these things earlier, so I won't go through the list, and we also, for our authors would hand you a document that says, here are some things you might want to think about. But also think about, just as you're writing, think about the pieces of your work that might be relevant to a more general audience or to a more specific audience in a journal article, in a newsletter article for your society, some other way, things that can be sort of broken out in a small piece for a small purpose to help kind of just provide an excuse to get your material out there. Because the best things, excuse me, I have something in my throat. The best things you can do are to be not directly saying buy my book, but to be saying this is this cool topic, and also I have a book coming out. Those tend to work better.
And using your personal connections. Most folks in and around academic publishing, scholars, researchers, faculty, grad students, part of an ecosystem, and everyone's going to support everyone else in different ways. So, you know, we're always guiding authors to how to best use those connections. Don't overburden the folks who want to help you out, but help them be really effective. And so maybe that's a blurb on the back of your book, but maybe it's one strategically timed LinkedIn message to their network. I mean, it really depends on the connection. But again, most people want to help you. And by the way, you should go out and help them too, because it all comes back around.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I just want to wrap up quickly. I want to share two things that I think will be helpful to our audience. Number one is if you do want to follow up, you have any further questions, you watch the recording, and there's something we didn't touch on that you're curious about, feel free to be in touch with me, or feel free to be in touch with Anna-Lise or with Abby. They're happy to answer your questions and speak with you about your project. And so you can copy down those emails and be in touch. You can also learn more by visiting our respective websites. And I also want to encourage everyone to check out our upcoming events coming up later this month. We have another roundtable. We're going to be talking about COVID and how COVID-19, how the pandemic has changed publishing for authors and for publishers. I was hoping when I scheduled this that it would be a past tense session, but it seems like that is not the case. But there's definitely a lot to learn and a lot of insights which directly impact authors, which you may not always think of. Actually coming up a little bit later on in October, we've got an event, another roundtable about some of the discussions that we had today about writing a book for a broad audience, papademia, however you want to describe it, but trying to break out of the ivory tower and speak to academics or speak to general audience in an intelligent way. So I invite and encourage everyone to join us for those. Special thank you ×2 to Abby and Anna-Lise. I really appreciate your time and sharing insights. And I learned a lot today that in the first, when we did this live, I didn't learn and vice versa. So I'm sure we could have this conversation many more times and learn, but I'll spare you. But I do really appreciate your time and energy that you put into this. And insights, because this is really invaluable information. So thanks so much, and looking forward to continuing to be in touch.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Abby.
Bye.
Brilliant.
Bye.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.